The black card hit the marble counter with a soft thud, and suddenly the entire boutique went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes naturally, but the sharp, uncomfortable kind that cuts through conversations and makes everyone pretend they're not watching. I was 17, standing in the most exclusive boutique in Beverly Hills, and 3 sales associates were staring at my credit card like I'd just placed a live snake on their pristine counter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "This can't be real," whispered the blonde one, her manicured finger hovering over the card like she was afraid to touch it. The brunette next to her actually laughed, a quick, nervous sound that she tried to cover with her hand. And the third one, a tall redhead with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper expression, just looked at me with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your shoe. My name is Madeline Ross, and that Tuesday afternoon in October was supposed to be simple. Buy a dress for my mother's charity gala, use the credit card she'd given me specifically for this purpose, and get home in time for dinner. Instead, I found myself in the middle of what would become the most humiliating and ultimately transformative experience of my teenage years. But let me back up, because to understand what happened in that boutique, you need to understand where I came from and how I ended up holding a Black American Express card at 17 years old in the first place. I grew up in Westfield, New Jersey, in one of those neighborhoods where the houses are big but not mansion big, where success is measured but not flaunted. My mom, Victoria Ross, started her tech consulting firm when I was 5 years old, working 16-hour days from our basement while I colored at her feet. My dad, Marcus Ross, taught high school mathematics and coached the debate team. We weren't wealthy then. Comfortable, sure, but not wealthy. Everything changed when I was 14. Mom's company, Ross Tech Solutions, landed a contract with a major streaming platform to overhaul their entire user experience system. The project was supposed to take 6 months. It took 18, but when it was finished, Mom's little basement operation had become a $50 million enterprise almost overnight. Suddenly, we were moving to a different neighborhood, one where the driveways were circular and the mailboxes had family crests. I went from shopping at Target to having personal shoppers at Nordstrom, from family dinners at Applebee's to reservation-only restaurants where the menus didn't have prices. But here's the thing about sudden wealth. It doesn't change who you are inside, even when it changes everything around you. I was still the same girl who preferred books to parties, who felt more comfortable in jeans than designer dresses, who got nervous talking to new people. The money was Mom's achievement, not mine, and I never forgot that. Which is why, when Mom handed me that black card for the first time, I actually hesitated to take it. "Madeline, honey, you need something appropriate for the gala," she'd said, sitting at our new kitchen island that cost more than most people's cars. She was still in her work clothes, a sharp navy suit that made her look like the CEO she'd become, but her hair was escaping its neat bun the way it always did when she was tired. "I can't go with you this time. The Singapore deal is falling apart, and I've got calls all afternoon." The gala she was referring to was the annual Children's Hospital fundraiser, a black tie event where Chicago's elite gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves. Mom was being honored as Philanthropist of the Year, something that still felt surreal to all of us. 3 years ago, we were the family donating $20 to the silent auction. Now Mom was pledging $500,000. "Can't I just borrow something from your closet?" I'd asked, even though we both knew the answer. Mom was 5'4" and curvy. I was 5'8" and built like a runner, all legs and sharp angles. "Madeline." Her voice had that gentle but firm tone that meant the conversation was over. "You're going to be sitting at the head table with me. Pictures will be taken. This matters." She'd pressed the card into my palm, and I'd felt the weight of it. Not just the physical weight, though it was heavier than a regular credit card, but the emotional weight. The responsibility. The knowledge that this small piece of black metal represented everything my family had worked for and achieved. "There's a place called Étoile Boutique on Rodeo Drive," Mom had continued, already turning back to her laptop. "Sarah Morrison recommended it. She says they have the most beautiful evening wear on the West Coast. Just get something that makes you feel confident, okay?" That's how I found myself driving my mom's Tesla through Beverly Hills on a Tuesday afternoon, following GPS directions to a boutique I'd never heard of in a neighborhood where parking spaces cost more per hour than most people made in a day. Étoile Boutique sat between a jewelry store and an art gallery, its black storefront elegant and understated. The windows displayed only two items: a silver evening gown that looked like liquid metal, and a midnight blue cocktail dress with beading so intricate it seemed to capture and reflect light from every angle. No price tags, of course. When you can afford to shop here, price tags are just tacky reminders of a world most customers have left behind. I stood outside for a full minute, gathering courage. Through the glass, I could see the interior: cream marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and clothing displayed like art pieces in a museum. The sales associates moved with practiced grace, their own outfits probably costing more than my dad's monthly salary back when money mattered. The moment I walked through those doors, I felt the shift. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I watched their expressions change in real time. Initial professional politeness gave way to confusion, then suspicion. I was wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a simple black sweater. Expensive enough, but not obviously so. My hair was in a messy bun, and I carried a basic leather purse instead of something with a recognizable designer logo. More importantly, I was 17 and black and alone in a space that clearly expected its customers to be older, whiter, and accompanied by personal assistants or wealthy husbands. "Can I help you?" The blonde associate, her name tag read Ashley, approached me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She was maybe 25, with the sort of polished appearance that spoke of expensive skincare routines and weekly salon appointments. "I'm looking for an evening gown," I'd said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel, something appropriate for a charity gala. Ashley's smile flickered, and I saw her glance toward her colleagues. The brunette Jessica was pretending to arrange jewelry in a display case, but I could feel her attention. The redhead, Brittany, wasn't even pretending not to stare. "What kind of budget are we working with?" Ashley asked, and there was something in her tone that made my stomach tighten. Not judgment, exactly, but assumption. The assumption that whatever number I gave would be too small for the merchandise surrounding us. That's when I pulled out the black card. And that's when everything went silent. "This can't be real," Ashley whispered again, and this time she wasn't trying to be discreet about it. Jessica actually walked over, abandoning all pretense of doing anything else. "I mean, look at her," Jessica said, her voice low but not low enough. "She's, what, 16? 17? How does a kid have a card like that?" Brittany crossed her arms and studied me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "Maybe it's fake. You can buy anything online these days." My cheeks burned, but I kept my voice steady. "It's not fake. My mother gave it to me to purchase a dress for this weekend's Children's Hospital Gala." The 3 women exchanged looks that spoke volumes. Ashley picked up the card with 2 fingers like she was handling something distasteful and held it up to the light. "Brittany," she said, "call the credit card company. I want to verify this before we waste anyone's time." And just like that, I went from customer to suspect. In the span of 30 seconds, I had been transformed from a girl shopping for a dress into a potential criminal whose crime was being young and black and holding a credit card these women had decided I couldn't possibly deserve. The boutique's other customers, 2 middle-aged women browsing scarves, and an older gentleman waiting in a chair while someone tried on dresses in the fitting room, weren't even pretending not to watch anymore. The assumption hung in the air like expensive perfume, suffocating and impossible to ignore. I stood there, watching Ashley examine my credit card like a forensic expert, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, that would come later. What I felt in that moment was a cold, clear understanding of exactly where I stood and exactly what these people thought of me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this wasn't just any black card, this wasn't just my mother's credit card. This was a Centurion card with a spending limit higher than most people's annual salaries, linked to accounts that could buy and sell their precious boutique 10 times over. What they also didn't know was that my mother wasn't just successful, she was powerful, and she was about to teach them the difference. Brittany walked to the back of the store with my credit card, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and I found myself counting them, 1, 2, 3, until she disappeared behind a curtained area that probably served as their office. The boutique fell into an uncomfortable quiet, the kind where even the air conditioning seemed too loud. Ashley and Jessica flanked me like I was a flight risk, their professional smiles now completely abandoned. The other customers had stopped all pretense of shopping and were openly staring, whispering behind their hands like I couldn't see them. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to grab my card, walk out, and find somewhere else to shop. But something deeper kept me rooted to that spot. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe just the knowledge that running would confirm everything these women already believed about me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started typing a text to my mom. At a boutique, having some issues with the card verification might take longer than expected. Her response came back almost immediately. Issues? What kind of issues? I'll call the bank. No need, I typed back quickly. Just being extra careful. Everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel the weight of every gaze in that store. The elderly gentleman in the chair had lowered his newspaper completely and was watching me with undisguised curiosity. The two women browsing scarves had moved closer, pretending to examine a display of handbags that gave them a perfect view of the unfolding drama. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ashley cleared her throat and attempted to break the tension. "So," she said with forced casualness, "are you from around here?" The question seemed innocent enough, but I heard the subtext. What she was really asking was, how did you end up here? Where do you belong? What's your story that explains why a black teenager is standing in our exclusive boutique with a credit card that costs more than most people's cars? New Jersey originally, I said. We moved to Los Angeles last year. Oh, how nice. Jessica joined the conversation, though her tone suggested she found nothing nice about it at all. What do your parents do? There it was, the fishing expedition. The attempt to categorize me, to figure out if I was worth their time, or if this was all some elaborate mistake. I could have told them my mother was Victoria Ross, that Ross Tech Solutions had just closed a deal with Netflix, that we lived in a house with 7 bedrooms and a view of the Hollywood Hills. But something about their attitude made me want to make them work for it. My mom's in tech consulting, I said simply. My dad teaches. I watched their faces process this information. Tech consulting could mean anything from fixing computers at a repair shop to running a billion-dollar corporation. Teaching could mean public school or private tutoring wealthy kids. They were getting no satisfaction from my answers, and their frustration was becoming more obvious by the minute. That's when Brittany emerged from the back room, and her expression told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. She was holding my credit card between 2 fingers like it was contaminated, and her face had settled into a mask of barely concealed disgust. Behind her trailed a man I hadn't seen before. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. His nameplate read Richard Sterling, manager, and he carried himself with the authority of someone used to handling difficult situations. "Miss," Brittany said, not bothering to hide her satisfaction, "we've encountered a problem with your card." My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of problem?" "The credit card company is reporting some irregularities," Richard Sterling said, stepping forward. His voice was smooth, professional, but with an underlying coldness that made my skin crawl. "They're asking us to retain the card pending further investigation." The word retain hit me like a physical blow. They wanted to keep my card. They were essentially accusing me of credit card fraud, theft, or worse. The other customers weren't even pretending to shop anymore. They had formed a small semicircle around us, watching the show like we were entertainment. "That's impossible," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me call my mother. She can verify." "I'm afraid that won't be necessary," Sterling interrupted, his tone becoming firmer. "Company policy requires us to follow the credit card company's instructions. We'll need to hold on to this card." "You can't just take my credit card," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "That's not how this works." "Actually," Brittany said with obvious pleasure, "it's exactly how this works. When someone attempts to use fraudulent payment methods in our establishment, we have both the right and the responsibility to intervene." The word fraudulent hung in the air like an accusation. Around us, I could hear murmurs from the other customers. Fraudulent? Poor thing. I knew something was off. The elderly man shook his head disapprovingly, though whether at me or the situation I couldn't tell. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from pure, undiluted anger. These people had looked at me, seen a young black girl with a credit card they decided I couldn't possibly deserve, and had immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. No benefit of the doubt, no consideration that there might be a legitimate explanation, just straight to fraud. "Fine," I said, my voice tight with controlled fury. "Keep the card, but I want to see exactly what the credit card company told you. I want to see the documentation of these so-called irregularities." Sterling's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing irritation underneath. "Miss, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. We're being very accommodating by handling this quietly. Most establishments would have called security by now." "Security?" The word came out louder than I intended, and I saw several customers take a step back. "Security for what? For trying to buy a dress with my own credit card?" "For attempting to make fraudulent purchases," Ashley said, her earlier nervousness replaced by emboldened confidence now that her manager was backing her up. "Look, we all feel bad about this, but you have to understand our position. A girl your age, with a card like that, showing up alone, it raises red flags." "Red flags," I repeated slowly. "What exactly are those red flags, Ashley? Please, explain them to me." She faltered, realizing she was walking into dangerous territory. "Well, I mean, it's just unusual." "Unusual how?" "You know, for someone like you." "Someone like me?" My voice was deadly quiet now. "And what exactly am I like, Ashley?" The boutique had gone completely silent. Even the soft jazz music playing in the background seemed to have stopped. Sterling was shooting warning looks at Ashley, clearly recognizing that she was about to say something that could land them in serious legal trouble. But Ashley was too far down the path to stop now. "Look, I'm not trying to be mean, but let's be realistic here. You're a teenager, you're wearing clothes from, well, not exactly high-end stores, and you walk in here alone with a black American Express card. It just doesn't add up." "Doesn't add up to what?" "To someone who belongs in a place like this." There it was, the truth, finally spoken aloud. I didn't belong. Not because I couldn't afford to shop there, not because I was rude or inappropriate, but because of how I looked and what they assumed about me based on my appearance. The elderly gentleman in the chair actually gasped. One of the women browsing scarves covered her mouth with her hand. Even Jessica looked uncomfortable with how explicitly Ashley had stated what they'd all been thinking. But I felt something unexpected happen at that moment. Instead of shame or embarrassment, I felt a cold, clear sense of purpose settle over me. These people had made their choice. They had decided who I was and what I was worth, based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. Now they were going to learn exactly how wrong they were. "I see," I said calmly, pulling out my phone again. "And what would someone who belongs here look like exactly?" Sterling stepped forward quickly, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Miss, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I said, my eyes never leaving Ashley's face. "Your employee just made it very clear that she doesn't think I belong in your store. I'm curious about the criteria you used to determine that." My phone was recording now, though I held it casually at my side where they couldn't see. I'd learned this trick from my dad, who'd started recording every interaction with police after getting pulled over 3 times in our new neighborhood for driving suspiciously, which apparently meant driving while black in a nice car. "Ashley misspoke," Sterling said quickly. "We welcome all customers who can afford our merchandise." "But you've already determined I can't afford it, haven't you? Without even checking. You've decided my credit card is fraudulent, you've decided I don't belong here, and you've decided all of this based on what? Exactly?" The silence stretched on. No one wanted to answer that question because the honest answer would be a lawsuit waiting to happen. "You know what's interesting?" I continued, my voice still deadly calm. "I came in here to buy a dress. One dress. For a charity event my mother is being honored at. Instead, I've been accused of fraud, had my credit card confiscated, and been told I don't belong in your store. All without anyone even bothering to ask my name." What is your name?" Sterling asked quietly. I smiled then, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Madeline Ross. My mother is Victoria Ross, CEO of Ross Tech Solutions." Perhaps you've heard of it? We just went public last month, valued at about $800 million. The color drained from Ashley's face. Jessica actually took a step backward. Even Sterling looked like someone had just punched him in the stomach. Now, I continued, would you like to explain to me again why my credit card is fraudulent? Or why don't I belong in your store? Because I'm very curious to hear the explanation now that you know who my mother is. But before any of them could answer, my phone started buzzing with an incoming call. I looked down at the screen and couldn't help but smile wider. It was my mother. And from the rapid-fire buzzing of texts that followed, I could tell that someone had already called her company about the credit card issue, which meant she already knew what was happening, which meant these people had no idea what was about to hit them. "Excuse me," I said politely, answering the phone. "Hi, Mom." "Madeline Rose Ross," came my mother's voice, so loud that everyone in the boutique could hear it clearly. "Please tell me you are not standing in some store while people are questioning the validity of the credit card I personally handed you this morning." "I'm afraid I am, Mom." "And are these people aware that they have just called my personal banking representative to question a credit card linked to accounts that could buy their entire store 3 times over?" I looked around at the faces surrounding me, Ashley pale and shaking, Jessica backing toward the door, Sterling looking like he was calculating lawsuits in his head. "I'm not sure they're aware of that, no." "Put me on speaker." I held the phone out and pressed the speaker button. My mother's voice filled the boutique, clear and controlled and absolutely furious. "This is Victoria Ross, CEO of Ross Tech Solutions. To whom am I speaking?" Sterling cleared his throat nervously. "This is Richard Sterling, manager of Etoile Boutique. Ma'am, I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "Oh, there's been a misunderstanding, all right. The misunderstanding is that you people thought you could treat my daughter like a criminal without facing any consequences. How wrong you were." The silence that followed my mother's words was deafening. Sterling stood frozen, the phone in my hand might as well have been a live grenade. Around us, the other customers had gone from curious observers to uncomfortable witnesses, suddenly aware they were watching something that had moved far beyond boutique drama into territory that could end up in newspapers. "Mr. Sterling," my mother's voice continued through the speaker, each word crisp and deliberate, "I'm going to ask you a very simple question, and I want a very honest answer. What specific evidence do you have that my daughter's credit card is fraudulent?" Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I could see sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the boutique's perfect climate control. "Well, ma'am, we received information from the credit card company." "Which credit card company?" Well, American Express." "And what specifically did American Express tell you?" The pause stretched on. I watched Sterling's face cycle through emotions, confusion, panic, and then a dawning realization that made him look physically sick. They said there were irregularities." "Mr. Sterling," my mother's voice had gone dangerously quiet, "I want you to call American Express right now while I'm on the phone and repeat exactly what they told you about my daughter's card." "Ma'am, I don't think that's necessary." "I think it's very necessary. Because here's what I suspect happened. Your employees saw a young black girl with an expensive credit card, decided she couldn't possibly deserve it, and created a story about credit card companies and irregularities to justify their discrimination. Am I warm?" Ashley had gone completely white and was now gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Jessica had actually moved to stand behind a clothing rack, as if expensive dresses could somehow shield her from what was happening. But I wasn't about to let my mother fight this battle for me. Not entirely. "Mom," I said, taking the phone off speaker but keeping it loud enough for everyone to hear, "before you continue, I think you should know exactly what happened here." "Tell me." I looked directly at Ashley as I spoke. When I walked in, they immediately questioned whether I belonged here. When I presented the credit card, they called it fake. Ashley specifically said that someone like me, wearing clothes from non-high-end stores, being a teenager, couldn't possibly have a legitimate black card. She said I didn't look like someone who belongs in a place like this. The sharp intake of breath from my mother was audible throughout the boutique. When she spoke again, her voice had gone from angry to absolutely glacial. "Put me back on speaker." I did, and my mother's voice filled the space like a judge delivering a verdict. Ashley, is it? Ashley, did you just tell my daughter that she doesn't look like she belongs in your store? Ashley was trembling now, but to her credit, or perhaps her detriment, she tried to defend herself. Ma'am, that's not, it was taken out of context. We have to be careful about fraud. Fraud, my mother repeated. Let me tell you about fraud, Ashley. Fraud is when someone misrepresents themselves or their circumstances for personal gain. Like when a boutique employee pretends to care about fraud prevention when they're actually just uncomfortable serving black customers. That's not what this is about, Sterling jumped in desperately. We serve all customers equally. Really? Then explain to me why you confiscated my daughter's credit card without calling me first. Explain why you didn't ask for additional identification. Explain why your first assumption was fraud rather than simply verifying the card through proper channels. Sterling opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because there was no good answer to that question, and we all knew it. Furthermore, my mother continued, explain to me why 3 adult employees thought it was appropriate to gang up on a 17-year-old girl instead of following basic customer service protocols. That's when something interesting happened. The elderly gentleman who had been watching from his chair stood up and walked over to us. He was probably in his 70s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of bearing that suggested old money and older power. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying easily through the boutique. I feel I need to interject here. Sterling looked like he was drowning, and someone had just thrown him a life preserver. Mr. Whitman, please, this is just a misunderstanding. But Mr. Whitman held up a hand to silence him. I've been sitting here for the past 20 minutes, watching this entire situation unfold, and I have to say I'm appalled. For a moment, Sterling looked hopeful. Then Mr. Whitman continued. I've been shopping at this boutique for 15 years. My late wife bought her evening wear here, my daughters have shopped here, and I've recommended this place to dozens of friends. And in all that time, I have never seen such a disgraceful display of prejudice and unprofessionalism. Ashley actually gasped. Jessica looked like she might faint. This young lady, Mr. Whitman gestured toward me, walked in here politely, stated her needs clearly, and presented payment. Instead of helping her, your staff immediately questioned her right to be here. I heard every word, and frankly, I'm disgusted. He turned to address my mother through the phone. Mrs. Ross, my name is Harold Whitman. I'm a long-time customer here, and I want you to know that what happened to your daughter was completely unacceptable. These employees made assumptions based purely on her appearance and age, and they should be ashamed of themselves. Thank you, Mr. Whitman, my mother's voice came through clearly. I appreciate you speaking up. It's the least I can do. Frankly, I should have said something sooner. He turned back to Sterling. Richard, I'm canceling my standing orders. My family will no longer be shopping here, and I'll be making sure my friends know exactly why. The 2 women who had been browsing scarves approached hesitantly. The older of the 2, a well-dressed black woman, probably around my mother's age, cleared her throat. Excuse me, I'm Dr. Patricia Williams, and this is my sister Sandra. We couldn't help but overhear, and we want you to know that we witnessed everything that happened here today. She looked directly at Sterling. What your employees did was not just wrong, it was illegal. This is textbook discrimination, and frankly, if this young lady were my daughter, you'd already be hearing from my attorneys. Sandra nodded emphatically. We came in here to browse, but after what we've seen, we won't be making any purchases, and like Mr. Whitman, we'll be telling our friends about this. I felt something shift inside me as I listened to these strangers defend me. The isolation I'd felt when this whole thing started was dissolving, replaced by something stronger. These people didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, but they were willing to stand up for what was right. But I also realized something else. I didn't need them to fight this battle for me. I had my own power, my own voice, and my own strength. Thank you all, I said clearly, looking around at the faces that had gone from hostile to supportive, but I want to address something directly. I turned to Ashley, who was still gripping the counter like her life depended on it. Ashley, you said I don't look like someone who belongs in a place like this. I want you to explain to me exactly what someone who belongs here looks like. I didn't mean... You meant exactly what you said. You looked at me and decided that my age, my race, and my clothes meant I couldn't possibly afford to shop here. You didn't see a customer. You saw a problem that needed to be solved. My voice was getting stronger with each word. You know what's ironic? I came in here planning to spend probably $5,000 or $6,000 on a dress. Just one dress, for one night. Because that's what my mother taught me. When something is important, you invest in quality. Sterling's eyes went wide. $5,000 was probably a good day's sales for them. But more than that, I continued, my mother was planning to recommend this boutique to her friends. Do you know how many wealthy women are in my mother's network? Do you know how much business you just lost because you couldn't see past your own prejudices? Ashley was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with the back of her hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But you did mean to make me feel unwelcome, I said. You did mean to question my right to be here. You did mean to treat me like a potential criminal instead of a customer. The only thing you didn't mean was for there to be consequences. Through the phone, I could hear my mother typing rapidly on her keyboard. Madeline, honey, I want you to listen to me carefully. I've just spoken with our legal team. What happened here today constitutes a clear violation of your civil rights. These people discriminated against you based on your race and age, and they did it in front of witnesses. Sterling went completely white. Ma'am, surely we can resolve this without involving lawyers. Oh, we're well past that point, my mother said calmly, but here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to return my daughter's credit card immediately and apologize sincerely for confiscating it without cause. Second, you're going to provide excellent customer service and help her find whatever she needs for this weekend's gala. Third, you're going to implement immediate staff training on discrimination and bias, because clearly your current training is inadequate. And if we refuse? Sterling asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then this conversation will be happening with my lawyers instead of with me, and I promise you they're much less reasonable than I am. I watched Sterling's face as he calculated the cost of fighting a discrimination lawsuit against a woman who could afford to drag it out for years. The math wasn't complicated. Of course, he said quickly. Absolutely. Ashley, please return Miss Ross's credit card immediately. Ashley scurried to the back room and returned with my card, holding it out like an offering. Her hands were shaking as she placed it on the counter. I'm so sorry, she said again, and this time I could hear genuine remorse in her voice. I was completely wrong. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I picked up my credit card and slipped it back into my purse. You're right, I said simply. There isn't. But as I stood there, looking at these people who had just learned a very expensive lesson about assumptions and prejudice, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every young person, every person of color, every person who didn't fit their narrow definition of what a customer should look like. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice carrying the same authority I'd inherited from my mother. I'm still going to shop here today. Not because I forgive you, but because I refuse to let your prejudice chase me away from getting what I came for. You're going to help me find the perfect dress, and you're going to provide the same level of service you would give to any other customer spending thousands of dollars in your store. How could? I paused, looking each of them in the eye. And then, when I leave here today, you're going to remember this moment every time a young person walks through your doors. Every time someone doesn't look like your typical customer. You're going to remember that you have no idea who they are, what they're capable of, or what they deserve until you take the time to find out. The silence that followed was different from all the others that had filled the boutique that day. This wasn't uncomfortable or tense. It was the silence of people who had just been fundamentally changed by an experience they would never forget. My mother's voice came through the phone one more time, softer now but no less powerful. Madeline, baby, I'm proud of you. Handle your business, and I'll see you at home for dinner. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the scared, humiliated girl who had walked into this boutique an hour ago was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that she could face down injustice and come out victorious. The real test, though, was just beginning. The boutique had transformed into something entirely different from the exclusive sanctuary it had been an hour earlier. What started as a place where whispers were currency and judgment was served with champagne had become a courtroom where truth was being weighed and measured. But I wasn't finished yet, not even close. Now, I said, looking directly at Sterling, I believe you mentioned something about providing excellent customer service. Let's see what that looks like. Sterling nodded rapidly, sweat still visible on his forehead despite his attempts to regain composure. Of course, Miss Ross. Ashley, Jessica, please assist Miss Ross with whatever she needs. But Ashley was still crying, mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks, and Jessica looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. They were broken, humiliated, and completely incapable of providing the kind of service I deserved after what they'd put me through. Actually, I said calmly, I think I'd prefer someone else to help me. Someone who wasn't involved in treating me like a criminal. That's when a voice I hadn't heard before spoke up from near the fitting rooms. I can help you. Everyone turned to see a young woman emerging from the back of the store. She was maybe 25, with curly brown hair and kind eyes, wearing the same sophisticated black uniform as the others but carrying herself differently. Where Ashley, Jessica, and even Sterling moved with practiced superiority, this woman had an authenticity that was immediately apparent. This is Sophia Martinez, Sterling said quickly, clearly grasping for any lifeline. She's our senior styling consultant. She was helping another customer in the private fitting area. Sophia stepped forward and extended her hand to me. I heard everything that happened out here, she said quietly, and I want you to know that not everyone who works here thinks the way they do. I studied her face, looking for any trace of the insincerity I'd encountered from the others. But all I saw was genuine regret and what looked like anger on my behalf. You heard everything? I asked. Every word. I've been working in the back with Mrs. Chen. She gestured toward the fitting rooms where an elegant Asian woman in her 60s was now watching us with interest. But we could hear the whole conversation. What they did to you was disgusting. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her movements graceful despite her obvious anger. I've been shopping here for 10 years, she said in accented but perfect English. Never have I seen such treatment. This is not how civilized people behave. She turned to Sterling with the kind of cold fury that only comes from decades of quiet authority. Mr. Sterling, I am Helen Chen. My husband owns Chen Industries. Perhaps you've heard of it. We manufacture the security systems for most of the high-end retailers in Beverly Hills, including this store. Sterling's face went from pale to gray. Chen Industries wasn't just any company. They were the invisible backbone that kept luxury retail functioning in Los Angeles. Mrs. Chen, I assure you. You assure me nothing, she cut him off with quiet steel. What I witnessed today was discrimination, pure and simple. And I will be sharing this experience with my husband and our business associates. But the real turning point came when Sophia stepped closer to me and lowered her voice so only I could hear. Miss Ross, there's something you need to know. They didn't call American Express about your card. I stared at her. What? They never called anyone. Brittany went to the back room, waited 5 minutes, and came back with that story about irregularities. I heard her talking to Jessica about it. They made the whole thing up because they were too embarrassed to admit they'd just assumed your card was fake. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I was surprised. Part of me had suspected as much. But because hearing it confirmed made the whole situation even more outrageous than I'd imagined. They hadn't just discriminated against me, they'd fabricated evidence to justify their discrimination. Are you willing to say that in front of everyone? I asked. Sophia nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. I took a deep breath and turned back to the group. Mr. Whitman was still standing nearby, his face set in stern disapproval. Dr. Williams and her sister Sandra had moved closer, clearly invested in seeing how this played out. Even Mrs. Chen had positioned herself where she could watch everything unfold. Sophia, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, would you please repeat what you just told me? Sterling's face went from gray to green as Sophia stepped forward. They never called American Express, she announced clearly. Brittany went to the back room and pretended to make a call, then came back and lied about the credit card company reporting irregularities. I heard her and Jessica discussing it. They made up the entire story. The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley actually gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. Jessica started backing toward the door again, but Sterling's reaction was the most telling. He closed his eyes like someone had just delivered a death sentence. Is this true? Mrs. Chen asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Sterling opened his mouth, clearly considering whether he could deny it. But the weight of all the witnesses and the certainty that the truth would come out anyway seemed to crush any remaining fight out of him. "There seems to have been a miscommunication," he said weakly. "A miscommunication," I repeated. "So you're saying your employee committed fraud, actual fraud, by fabricating a story about my credit card being illegitimate?" "Now wait just a minute." "No, you wait," I said, my voice rising. "You want to talk about fraud? Let's talk about fraud. Your employee deliberately lied about contacting a credit card company, created false evidence of wrongdoing, and used that fabricated evidence to confiscate my property. That's not discrimination, that's theft under false pretenses." Mr. Whitman shook his head in disgust. "This just keeps getting worse. Richard, in all my years of business, I've never seen such a complete breakdown of professional standards." But I wasn't done. The anger that had been building inside me since I first walked through those doors was now crystallizing into something else. A cold, calculating fury that wanted consequences, not just apologies. "You know what's interesting?" I said, pulling out my phone again. "I've been recording this entire conversation, every word, every admission, every lie." Sterling's eyes went wide. "You can't record in here without permission." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "California is a one-party consent state. I only need my own permission to record a conversation I'm participating in. And given that your employees just admitted to fabricating evidence against me, I'd say this recording is going to be very valuable." The power dynamic in the room shifted completely in that moment. Where before they had held all the cards, the authority, the assumptions, the ability to kick me out, now I held something much more powerful, the truth, documented, and undeniable. "What do you want?" Sterling asked quietly. It was a simple question, but it opened up possibilities I hadn't even considered when I first walked into this boutique. What did I want? An apology? Compensation? To see these people fired? To make sure this never happened to anyone else? "First," I said, "I want Brittany out here to explain herself. She's the one who fabricated the credit card story, and she's been hiding in the back room long enough." Sterling nodded reluctantly and called toward the back. "Brittany, please come out here." When Brittany emerged, she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Her earlier confidence was completely gone, replaced by the hunted look of someone who knew they'd been caught in a lie that could destroy their career. "Brittany," I said directly, "did you call American Express about my credit card?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was a misunderstanding. "Did you call American Express? Yes or no?" "No," she whispered. "Did you fabricate the story about irregularities on my account?" It wasn't meant to. I just thought..." "Yes or no, Brittany? Did you make up the story about my credit card being problematic?" "Yes." The admission hung in the air like a confession in court. Mrs. Chen actually shook her head in disgust. Dr. Williams was typing rapidly on her phone, probably sharing the story with her own network. "And why did you do that?" I pressed. Brittany was crying now, just like Ashley had been. Because I didn't think you could really have a card like that. I thought you must have stolen it or something." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on how you looked." There it was again. The truth that kept surfacing, no matter how much they tried to bury it under talk of policies and procedures and misunderstandings. They had looked at me and decided I was a criminal based purely on my appearance. But that's when something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed with a text message, and when I looked down, I saw it was from my mom. "Honey, I'm in the car. I'll be there in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That meant she'd left her office, left her important calls and meetings, and was driving across the city to deal with this situation in person. That meant this was about to escalate to a level none of these people were prepared for. But it also meant I had 10 minutes to decide exactly how I wanted this to end. I looked around the boutique, at Sterling sweating through his expensive suit, at Ashley and Brittany crying over the consequences of their actions, at Jessica trying to make herself invisible, at Sophia standing ready to help me, at the customers who had become witnesses and advocates. And I realized I had a choice to make. I could wait for my mother to arrive and watch her tear this place apart with the full force of her wealth and power. Or I could handle this myself, on my own terms, in my own way. "Sophia," I said finally, "I still need a dress for Saturday night. Are you willing to help me find one?" She nodded immediately. I'd be honored to. Good. Then here's what's going to happen. I looked directly at Sterling. You're going to give me the VIP treatment. Private fitting room, champagne, the works. Sophia is going to help me find the perfect dress, and you're going to make sure I have the best shopping experience of my life. Sterling nodded frantically. Of course, absolutely. I'm not finished. My voice cut through his eagerness like a blade. You're also going to fire Brittany. Today, right now. What she did wasn't just discrimination. It was fraud. She fabricated evidence and theft, and if she's willing to do that to me, she'll do it to other customers. Brittany went white. Please, I need this job. You should have thought about that before you decided to lie about me being a criminal. I turned back to Sterling. Ashley and Jessica are going to undergo immediate training on discrimination and bias. Not next week, not next month. They're going to start today. And they're going to write personal apologies, not corporate form letters, explaining exactly what they did wrong and how they're going to do better. Yes, of course. And finally, I continued, this boutique is going to implement a new policy. Anytime a customer's payment method is questioned, you have to actually verify with the credit card company before taking any action. No more assumptions, no more made-up stories, no more treating customers like criminals based on how they look. The boutique was completely silent as I laid out my terms. These weren't requests. They were demands, backed by the power of documented evidence and the knowledge that my mother would be walking through those doors in less than 10 minutes. Do we have an agreement? I asked. Sterling nodded so vigorously I thought his head might fall off. Yes, absolutely. Everything you've asked for. Good, I said, and for the first time since walking into this boutique, I smiled. Then let's go shopping. But as Sophia led me toward the private fitting area, I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against marble, moving with purpose and power. I turned toward the entrance and saw my mother walking through the doors of Étoile Boutique. Victoria Ross had arrived. And from the expression on her face, I could tell that everything I'd just accomplished was only the beginning. When my mother walked through the doors of Étoile Boutique, the entire atmosphere changed. It wasn't just that she commanded attention, though she certainly did, wearing a charcoal Armani suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. It wasn't even her presence, though Victoria Ross had the kind of energy that could fill a boardroom or silence a hostile crowd. It was the way everyone in that boutique suddenly understood that they were no longer dealing with a 17-year-old girl they could intimidate. They were facing a woman who had built an empire from nothing, who negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and who had just discovered that someone had treated her daughter like a criminal. Madeline, she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Sterling visibly flinch. Are you all right? I'm fine, Mom, I said, and I meant it. The scared, humiliated girl from an hour ago was gone. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm handling things. Mom's eyes swept the boutique, taking in the scene. Ashley still tear-stained and shaking, Brittany pale and cornered, Jessica trying to disappear into the background, Sterling sweating despite the air conditioning, and the various customers who had become unwilling participants in this drama. I can see that, she said, and there was pride in her voice. But now that I'm here, perhaps we can discuss some additional consequences for what happened today. She walked towards Sterling with the measured pace of someone who knew she held all the power in the room. Mr. Sterling, I believe we spoke on the phone. Yes, ma'am, Sterling managed. And I want to assure you that we've resolved the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Mom repeated the word, like she was tasting something bitter. Is that what we're calling it when your employees fabricate evidence to justify discriminating against a paying customer? Ma'am, I think there were some communication errors. Communication errors, she said, pulling out her phone. Let me communicate something to you very clearly. I've spent the last 15 minutes in my car, making phone calls. Would you like to know who I called? Sterling's face went from pale to green. I'm not sure. First, I called my legal team. They're very interested in this case, particularly the fraud aspect. Apparently, fabricating stories about credit card companies is both civil and criminal fraud. Brittany made a small whimpering sound. Ashley covered her mouth with her hand. Second, I called the Better Business Bureau. They were fascinated to hear about a boutique that confiscates customers' credit cards based on false claims. Mrs. Ross, surely we can resolve this. Third, Mom continued, as if Sterling hadn't spoken, I called the Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce. Apparently, discrimination cases are very bad for the city's reputation. She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final blow. And fourth, I called Marcus Thompson at the Los Angeles Times. You know Marcus, don't you? He covers business and social justice issues. He's very interested in stories about discrimination at high-end retailers. The color drained completely from Sterling's face. A story in the LA Times would be devastating, not just for him personally, but for the entire boutique. High-end retail lived and died by reputation, and a discrimination scandal in a major newspaper would be a death sentence. He'll be here in 30 minutes, Mom added casually, along with a photographer. That's when Sterling completely panicked. Mrs. Ross, please, I'm sure we can work something out. What would it take to resolve this privately? Mom looked at him for a long moment, and I could see her calculating not just what she wanted, but what would be fair, what would be just, and what would prevent this from happening to someone else. What would it take? She repeated. Let's start with the obvious. Brittany is fired, effective immediately, for fraud and discrimination. Done, Sterling said without hesitation. Ashley and Jessica will undergo extensive diversity and bias training, not just a one-day seminar, but a comprehensive program. They'll also write detailed reports on what they learned and how they plan to change their behavior. Of course. The boutique will implement new policies about payment verification, customer treatment, and escalation procedures. These policies will be reviewed by an outside consultant who specializes in discrimination prevention. Sterling nodded frantically. Absolutely. And, Mom continued, the boutique will make a substantial donation to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, $50,000. Sterling winced but nodded. If that's what it takes. But Mom wasn't finished. However, all of that is just the beginning. Because what happened here today wasn't just about my daughter. It was about a pattern of behavior that suggests systemic problems with how this establishment treats customers who don't fit your narrow demographic expectations. She pulled out her phone and showed Sterling the screen. I've been researching your boutique while I drove over here. Very interesting Yelp reviews. Several complaints from young customers, customers of color, customers who felt unwelcome or treated poorly. Would you like me to read some of them? Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Felt judged the moment I walked in, Mom read. Staff followed me around like I was going to steal something. Asked if I was sure I could afford the prices before I even looked at anything. Made me feel like I didn't belong there. Each review was like a nail in a coffin. Sterling was starting to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and patterns were much harder to explain away. So here's what's really going to happen, Mom continued. Beyond the immediate consequences we just discussed, this boutique is going to undergo a complete review of its hiring practices, training programs, and customer service policies. You're going to hire a diversity consultant, at your expense, to conduct sensitivity training for your entire staff, including management. Yes, ma'am. You're also going to implement a customer feedback system that specifically asks about treatment and discrimination. And those feedback forms will be reviewed monthly by an outside auditor. Understood. Furthermore, you're going to establish a scholarship program for young women of color pursuing careers in fashion and retail, $25,000 annually. Sterling was getting paler with each requirement, but he kept nodding. And finally, Mom said, you're going to issue a public apology. Not a corporate non-apology that takes no responsibility, but a real apology that acknowledges what happened and what you're doing to prevent it from happening again. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of consequences. Sterling looked like a man who had just watched his comfortable world collapse around him, but it was Brittany who broke first. This isn't fair, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. I made a mistake, okay? But my whole career shouldn't be ruined because of one mistake. The entire boutique turned to look at her, and I saw my mother's expression shift from businesslike to personally offended. One mistake? Mom's voice was dangerously quiet. You fabricated evidence against my daughter. You lied about contacting a credit card company. You participated in discriminating against a customer based on her race and age. And you call that one mistake? I didn't mean for it to go this far. You meant to humiliate her, you meant to make her feel unwelcome, you meant to treat her like a criminal. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught." Brittany was crying again, but this time there was anger mixed with the tears. "You people always play the race card. Maybe if she hadn't acted so entitled." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even Ashley and Jessica looked horrified that Brittany had just made things exponentially worse. Mom's voice when she responded was colder than I'd ever heard it. "Mr. Sterling, I want that woman out of this store immediately. And I want to make something very clear. If she's not terminated right now, I will personally ensure that every business owner in Beverly Hills knows exactly what kind of employees you hire and protect." "Brittany," Sterling said quickly, "you're fired. Please collect your things and leave immediately." But Brittany wasn't finished destroying herself. "This is ridiculous. You people come in here acting like you own the place." "We could own this place," Mom said simply. "In fact, let me make a phone call." She dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. "David, it's Victoria Ross. I need you to look into the ownership structure of Etoile Boutique on Rodeo Drive. I'm interested in potentially acquiring it." The voice that came through the speaker was crisp and professional. "Of course, Victoria. Etoile is privately held by the Sterling family. I believe Richard Sterling is the current manager. Based on recent revenue reports, I'd estimate the business is worth approximately $2.8 million. Mom looked directly at Sterling. "David, what would it cost to make an all-cash offer they couldn't refuse?" "For a quick acquisition, probably $4 million would do it." Sterling had gone completely white. The boutique wasn't just his job, it was his family's legacy, built by his father 30 years ago. "Mrs. Ross," he said desperately, "please, that's not necessary. We can resolve this." Mom hung up the phone. "Can we?" "Because your employee just told me that my family doesn't belong here. She just said we're playing the race card for objecting to discrimination. She just demonstrated exactly the kind of toxic attitude that created this situation in the first place." She turned back to Brittany. "And you're right about one thing. We don't own this place. Yet. But we could. We could buy it, fire everyone who participated in today's discrimination and turn it into something better. The only reason we're not doing that is because my daughter asked me to give people a chance to do better." The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it was almost surreal. An hour ago, these people had held all the authority. Now they were begging a teenager and her mother not to destroy their livelihoods. But that's when Sophia stepped forward. Throughout this entire confrontation, she had been standing quietly nearby, but now she cleared her throat. "Mrs. Ross, if I may," she said respectfully. "I know you have every right to be angry, and what happened to your daughter was inexcusable. But I want you to know that not everyone here shares those attitudes." Mom looked at her with interest. "You're the stylist who offered to help Madeline?" "Yes, ma'am. And I want you to know that I've been working here for 3 years, and I've seen this kind of behavior before. I've tried to speak up. But I'm not in a position of authority. What happened today was wrong, but maybe this could be an opportunity to change things for the better instead of just destroying them." I watched my mother consider this. Victoria Ross didn't build a successful company by destroying everything that got in her way. She built it by finding ways to turn obstacles into opportunities. "What did you have in mind?" Mom asked. "Promote me to head of customer relations," Sophia said boldly. "Let me implement the new policies you're requiring. Let me train the staff and change the culture here. Give me the authority to make sure this never happens again." It was a gutsy move, asking for a promotion in the middle of a discrimination crisis. But it was also smart. Sophia was positioning herself as part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Sterling looked like he wanted to object, but he was in no position to argue with anything that might resolve this situation peacefully. Mom looked at me. "What do you think, Madeline? Should we give Ms. Martinez a chance to prove that this place can change?" I studied Sophia's face, looking for any trace of insincerity or opportunism, but all I saw was genuine determination and a desire to make things right. "I think we should," I said, "but with conditions." "What conditions?" Sterling asked nervously. "Sophia reports directly to my mother for the first 6 months," I said. "Every new policy, every training program, every customer complaint gets reviewed by Rostech Solutions' HR department. You don't get to implement changes and then slide back into old habits when the attention dies down." Mom smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since she walked into the boutique. "That's my daughter," she said proudly, always thinking 3 steps ahead. She turned back to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, you now have a choice. You can accept all of our conditions, implement real change, and potentially save your family's business. Or you can refuse, and I'll have my attorney here within the hour to begin acquisition proceedings." Sterling looked around the boutique, at the crying employees, the watching customers, the recording devices, and the woman who held his future in her hands. "We accept," he said quietly, "all conditions." But as I watched the relief flood his face, I realized that we had accomplished something more important than just getting justice for what happened to me. We had created a framework for change that could prevent this from happening to anyone else. The real test would be whether they followed through. 3 months later, I stood outside a Toile boutique on a crisp January morning, watching through the windows as Sofia Martinez conducted what looked like a training session with the staff. The boutique looked the same from the outside. Same elegant black storefront, same crystal chandeliers visible through the glass. But everything else had changed in ways I never could have imagined. The story of what happened that Tuesday in October had spread far beyond the walls of one Beverly Hills boutique. What started as a personal confrontation had become something much larger, much more significant, and much more complicated than any of us had anticipated. It began with Marcus Thompson's article in the LA Times, "Discrimination at Toile: How One Teen's Experience Sparked Retail Reform," ran on the front page of the business section, complete with photos of the boutique and interviews with witnesses. But Marcus had done something unexpected. Instead of just focusing on the discrimination, he'd highlighted the innovative solution my mother had negotiated. The article caught the attention of retail industry publications, civil rights organizations, and business schools. Within a week, I was getting calls from reporters, activists, and academics who wanted to understand how a discrimination incident had been transformed into a model for institutional change. Madeline, my mother, had said over breakfast that first week after the article ran, "I think you need to prepare yourself for what's coming. This story is bigger than just us now." She was right. The phone calls started small, a few local news stations, some bloggers, a handful of civil rights organizations. But then CNN picked up the story, focusing on how a teenager had stood up to discrimination and helped create lasting change. From there, it exploded across social media, with hashtags like #ToileEffect and #RetailAccountability trending for days. The response was overwhelming and complicated. Supporters praised our approach, saying we'd shown how to address discrimination constructively rather than just punitively. Critics argued we'd been too soft, that we should have pushed for criminal charges and massive financial penalties. Some people questioned whether real change was possible, while others held us up as an example of how to create meaningful reform. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source: other retailers. Within 6 weeks of the LA Times article, I'd received emails from over 40 retail establishments, from small boutiques to major department store chains, asking about the reform program we'd implemented at Toile. Store managers, corporate executives, and HR directors wanted to know about the training protocols, the oversight structure, and the feedback systems that had emerged from our settlement. "It's fascinating," said Dr. Angela Freeman, a business ethics professor at UCLA, who'd reached out to interview me for a case study she was developing. We were sitting in a coffee shop near campus, surrounded by stacks of papers and recordings of her interviews with various people involved in the Toile situation. "Your approach was simultaneously more aggressive and more collaborative than anything I've seen in 20 years of studying corporate discrimination cases," she continued. "You didn't just demand punishment. You demanded transformation. And more importantly, you created a mechanism for ensuring that transformation actually happened." Dr. Freeman had spent weeks interviewing everyone involved: my mother, Sofia, Sterling, even some of the customers who had witnessed the original incident. She had also been tracking the changes at Toile, documenting everything from staff turnover to customer feedback to sales figures. "The data is remarkable," she said, spreading charts across our table. "Customer satisfaction scores have increased by 38%. Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped to 0. And sales have actually increased by 15%, suggesting that creating a more welcoming environment has attracted new customers." But perhaps more interesting was what had happened to the people directly involved in the original incident. Ashley had initially resisted the mandated diversity training, but something had shifted during the program. She'd written a detailed apology letter, not just to me, but to other customers she realized she'd treated poorly over the years. More significantly, she'd requested additional training and had become one of the boutique's most effective advocates for inclusive customer service. "I never realized how my assumptions were affecting people," she'd said in a follow-up interview with Marcus Thompson. "I thought I was being professional, but I was actually being judgmental. The training helped me understand that my job isn't to decide who belongs in our store. It's to help everyone who walks through our doors feel welcome." Jessica had chosen to leave retail entirely, taking a job with a non-profit organization that worked on youth development programs. In her exit interview, she'd admitted that working at Etoile had always made her uncomfortable, but she'd never known how to address the culture of exclusivity and judgment. Brittany, unsurprisingly, had struggled more. After being fired from Etoile, she'd had difficulty finding another position in high-end retail. Word had spread about her role in the discrimination incident, and employers were reluctant to hire someone with that kind of reputation. She'd eventually found work at a department store in a different city, but the experience had clearly been humbling. Sterling had perhaps changed the most. The man who had seemed primarily concerned with protecting his business and avoiding lawsuits had become genuinely committed to reform. He'd implemented the oversight program more thoroughly than even my mother had required, bringing in additional consultants and expanding the training beyond what was mandated. "What happened that day was a wake-up call," he'd told Dr. Freeman. "I realized that my store had become a place that excluded people instead of welcoming them. That's not what my father intended when he opened this boutique, and it's not what I want my legacy to be." But the most dramatic transformation had been Sophia's rise to leadership. As the new head of customer relations, she'd redesigned every aspect of how Etoile interacted with customers. She'd implemented a buddy system for new employees, created detailed protocols for handling payment issues, and established monthly customer forums where people could provide feedback about their experiences. "Sophia has exceeded every expectation," my mother had told me after her latest oversight review. "She's not just implementing the changes we require, she's innovating beyond them. She's turned Etoile into a model for what inclusive retail can look like." The ripple effects had extended far beyond the boutique itself. The Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce had created a new certification program for businesses that met certain standards for inclusive customer service. The program was voluntary, but the public relations value was significant enough that dozens of businesses had already applied. The Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations had invited me to speak at their annual conference about discrimination in retail. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of business leaders, civil rights activists, and government officials, I'd realized how far the story had traveled from that Tuesday afternoon when I'd just wanted to buy a dress. What happened at Etoile wasn't just about one boutique or one incident, I'd told the audience. It was about a pattern of assumptions and behaviors that exist throughout our society. But it also showed that change is possible when we're willing to do the hard work of transformation rather than just punishment. The speech had been recorded and shared widely on social media, leading to even more opportunities to discuss the broader implications of what had happened. I'd been invited to speak at high schools, community organizations, and business conferences. Each audience brought different perspectives and questions, but the core message remained the same. Discrimination could be addressed constructively when institutions were willing to commit to real change. However, not everyone was convinced that the Etoile model was sufficient or sustainable. "I'm concerned that this approach lets discriminatory institutions off too easily," said Reverend Marcus Johnson, a civil rights leader who'd been critical of our settlement from the beginning. We were participating in a panel discussion at a community center in South Los Angeles, and his perspective represented a significant segment of the civil rights community. When businesses face real consequences for discrimination, lawsuits, financial penalties, criminal charges, it sends a message that this behavior won't be tolerated, he continued. But when we negotiate settlements that focus on reform rather than punishment, we might be encouraging other businesses to think they can discriminate with minimal consequences. It was a fair criticism, and one I'd wrestled with extensively. Had we been too lenient? Had we prioritized change over justice? Were we inadvertently encouraging other businesses to think they could buy their way out of discrimination scandals? "I understand that concern," I had responded. "But I also think we need to consider what actually creates lasting change." Punishing Etoile severely might have felt satisfying, but it wouldn't have prevented discrimination at other businesses. By creating a model for transformation, we've influenced dozens of other retailers to examine their own practices. The debate was ongoing and complex, with valid arguments on multiple sides. Some activists praised our approach as innovative and effective. Others criticized it as insufficient and potentially harmful to future civil rights enforcement. Legal scholars were divided on whether negotiated reform agreements were more effective than traditional litigation. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from other young people who'd experienced similar discrimination. I'd received hundreds of emails and social media messages from teenagers and young adults who'd been treated poorly while shopping, dining, or seeking services. Some shared stories remarkably similar to mine: assumptions about their ability to pay, questions about whether they belonged in certain spaces, treatment that made them feel unwelcome or suspected of wrongdoing. More importantly, many of these young people had been inspired to speak up about their own experiences rather than just accepting discriminatory treatment. They'd filed complaints with businesses, contacted civil rights organizations, and demanded better treatment. The Étoile story had shown them that they didn't have to simply endure discrimination. They could challenge it and potentially create change. "Your story gave me the courage to report what happened to me at a restaurant last month," wrote Maria Santos, a college student from Phoenix. "The manager dismissed me at first, but when I mentioned the Étoile case and explained how discrimination lawsuits work, suddenly they took me very seriously. Now they're implementing new training for their staff." These individual stories were perhaps more significant than any media coverage or academic analysis. They represented the real ripple effect: young people who felt empowered to stand up for themselves and demand the respect they deserved. But there were also broader institutional changes happening. The California state legislature had introduced a bill requiring certain types of businesses to implement anti-discrimination training and oversight programs. Several major retail chains had voluntarily adopted policies similar to what we'd implemented at Étoile. Business schools were developing case studies about our approach, training future executives to think differently about discrimination and corporate responsibility. 6 months after that Tuesday in October, I found myself back at Étoile, not as a customer this time, but as part of a UCLA business school field trip Dr. Freeman had organized. Her students were studying the boutique as an example of organizational change and corporate social responsibility. Sophia met us at the door, confident and professional in her new role. The boutique looked the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. The staff moved with genuine warmth rather than practiced superiority. I watched them interact with customers of all ages and backgrounds, treating everyone with the same level of respect and attention. "Welcome back," Sophia said to me quietly as the students toured the store. "I hope you can see that we've really changed." I could see it. But I could also see something else. This was just the beginning. The Étoile effect was spreading, creating conversations and changes that would continue long after the media attention died down. What had started as a personal encounter with discrimination had become a catalyst for examining how businesses treat customers, how assumptions shape interactions, and how commitment to change could transform entire industries. The real question wasn't whether we'd succeeded at Étoile. The real question was whether the model we'd created could continue to spread, influence, and evolve, creating a retail culture where what happened to me that Tuesday in October would become unthinkable rather than just unacceptable. 1 year later, I sat in the conference room of Ross Tech Solutions, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that had become as familiar as home. The city sprawled beneath us, millions of people going about their daily lives, most of them unaware that a single encounter in a Beverly Hills boutique had set in motion changes that were still reverberating through businesses, schools, and communities across the country. My mother was across the table, reviewing reports from what had become known as the Étoile Initiative, a comprehensive program we'd developed to help businesses implement inclusive customer service practices. What had started as oversight of one boutique's reform efforts had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated: a consulting firm focused on preventing discrimination in retail and service industries. 43 businesses have completed our certification program, Mom said, looking up from the quarterly reports. 17 more are in the application process, and we're getting inquiries from companies in 12 different states. The numbers were impressive, but they only told part of the story. Behind each certification was a business that had committed to examining its practices, training its staff, and creating systems to ensure all customers were treated with dignity and respect. Some had come to us after their own discrimination incidents. Others had reached out proactively, recognizing that inclusive practices weren't just morally right, they were good business. The most interesting applications are coming from places we never expected, I said, flipping through the files. That hotel chain in Atlanta, the car dealership network in Texas, even that country club in Connecticut. Industries that traditionally haven't been open to this kind of scrutiny. It was true. The étoile model has proven adaptable across different types of businesses and service environments. A luxury hotel had used our framework to address complaints about how they treated younger guests and families. A high-end car dealership had implemented our training after several incidents where salespeople had ignored or dismissed potential customers based on appearance. Even exclusive golf clubs and private clubs were beginning to examine their membership and guest policies. But the real measure of our impact wasn't in business statistics. It was in the individual stories that continued to reach us every week. Like the email from David Chen, a college sophomore who'd been followed around an electronics store by security guards until he'd calmly pulled out his phone, called the corporate headquarters, and referenced the étoile case. The store had immediately apologized, retrained their security staff, and offered David a part-time job in their customer service department. Or the letter from Rebecca Martinez, a high school senior who'd been told by a restaurant hostess that their establishment wasn't really for people like her. Instead of leaving, Rebecca had asked to speak with the manager, explained the legal and business implications of discrimination, and watched as the hostess was immediately sent for sensitivity training. "What's remarkable," said Dr. Freeman, who had become both a collaborator and chronicler of the Étoile Initiative, "is how you've created a vocabulary for these encounters. Young people aren't just walking away from discrimination anymore, they're addressing it directly, and they're doing it with sophistication and effectiveness." Dr. Freeman had been studying the long-term effects of our approach, tracking everything from changes in corporate policies to shifts in how discrimination incidents were reported and resolved. Her research had been published in several academic journals and had influenced business school curricula across the country. "The traditional civil rights model focused on punishment after the fact," she continued. "But what you've created is a framework for prevention and real-time intervention. You've shown people that they don't have to choose between accepting discrimination and engaging in lengthy legal battles." The academic attention had been gratifying, but it had also brought responsibility. Universities were inviting me to speak to business students, law students, and social justice organizations. Each speaking engagement was an opportunity to share not just what had happened, but what others could learn from it. The most powerful speaking opportunity had come from Harvard Business School, where I'd been invited to present a case study to MBA students studying organizational change and corporate social responsibility. Standing in that lecture hall, looking out at future business leaders from around the world, I'd felt the weight of possibility. "The question isn't whether discrimination exists in your industry," I'd told them. "It does. The question is whether you're going to be part of perpetuating it or part of changing it. And the choice you make will define not just your career, but the kind of world we create together." After my presentation, a student from Nigeria approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've experienced what you went through," she'd said quietly. "In stores, in restaurants, in job interviews. I always thought I just had to accept it or fight back alone. But you've shown that there's another way, a way to create change that lasts beyond just one incident." That conversation had crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. The Étoile story wasn't really about me, or even about that boutique. It was about a moment when someone decided that discrimination didn't have to be accepted as inevitable, that change was possible if you were willing to work for it systematically and strategically. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been the international attention. The story had been covered by media outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa, with business leaders and activists in other countries asking whether the Étoile model could be adapted to different cultural and legal contexts. A delegation from the European Union had visited our offices, interested in whether our approach could inform anti-discrimination policies across member nations. A business consortium from Japan had inquired about implementing similar programs in their retail sector. Even the United Nations had reached out about incorporating elements of our model into their business and human rights initiatives. "It's fascinating how a local incident became a global conversation," my mother had observed during one of these international meetings. "But I think it shows how universal these issues are. Discrimination might manifest differently in different cultures, but the underlying dynamics are remarkably similar." The global perspective had also highlighted something important. Change was happening in many places, often inspired by individual acts of courage, like what had occurred at Etoile. We weren't the only ones working on these issues, but we'd become part of a larger movement toward corporate accountability and inclusive business practices. However, the most personally meaningful developments had been much closer to home. Sterling had reached out 6 months after our settlement to ask if I'd be willing to serve on an advisory board he was creating for the boutique. The board would include young people, representatives from civil rights organizations, and business ethics experts who would provide ongoing guidance on inclusive practices. "I want to make sure we never slide backward," he'd said during our initial meeting, "and I think having voices like yours involved permanently is the best way to ensure that." I'd agreed, partly because I wanted to monitor Etoile's continued progress, but mostly because I believed Sterling's commitment to change was genuine. The boutique had become a model not just because of the policies we'd implemented, but because of the ongoing accountability and continuous improvement that those policies required. Sophia had been promoted again, this time to general manager, and had begun speaking at retail industry conferences about inclusive customer service. She'd also started mentoring young employees at other businesses, helping them navigate workplace cultures that might not always value diversity and inclusion. "What happened at Etoile changed my career trajectory completely," she'd told me during a recent visit. "I went from being someone who witnessed discrimination silently to someone who actively prevents it. And that's changed how I see my purpose in the world." Even Ashley had become an unexpected advocate. After completing her diversity training, she'd requested additional education in conflict resolution and cultural competency. She'd eventually left Etoile to work for our consulting firm, using her experience as someone who had participated in discrimination to help other employees recognize and change their own biases. "I can speak to people who are where I was," she'd explained when we hired her. "I understand the mindset that leads to discriminatory behavior because I lived it. And I understand the process of change because I've been through it. But perhaps the most important change had been in me. When I'd walked into Etoile that Tuesday afternoon, I'd been a teenager who just wanted to buy a dress and avoid conflict. The experience had forced me to find my voice, stand up for myself, and ultimately help create lasting change. But it had also shown me what I wanted to do with my life. I'd been accepted to several universities, but I'd decided to defer enrollment for a year to work full-time on the Etoile initiative. The work was too important, and the momentum too strong, to step away just yet. I was learning more about business, law, social justice, and leadership than any classroom could teach me. "You've become an entrepreneur," my mother had said with pride during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "You saw a problem, developed a solution, and built an organization to implement it. That's exactly what I did with Rostec, just in a different industry." The comparison was flattering, but it also highlighted something important about how change happens. My mother had built a technology company by identifying needs and creating solutions. What we'd done with the Etoile initiative was similar. We'd identified a need for better approaches to discrimination prevention and had created a systematic solution. But the real test of our impact wouldn't be measured in the number of businesses we'd certified or the media attention we'd received. It would be measured in the experiences of individual people who encountered businesses that had embraced inclusive practices. Like the email I'd received from Marcus Thompson, the journalist who'd first covered our story. "My teenage daughter went shopping at a high-end department store last weekend," he wrote. "She was treated with respect and kindness by staff who seemed genuinely interested in helping her find what she needed. When I asked her about the experience, she said it felt normal, like that's how shopping should be. And I realized that's exactly the point. You've helped create a world where inclusive treatment is becoming the norm rather than the exception." That was the ultimate goal, making respectful, inclusive customer service so standard that discrimination became unthinkable rather than just unacceptable. As I sat in that conference room, looking out at the city where so much had changed since that October afternoon, I thought about all the young people who were shopping, dining, and seeking services across Los Angeles and beyond. Many of them would never experience the kind of discrimination I'd faced, because businesses had learned to do better. Others might still encounter prejudice, but they'd have tools and models for addressing it constructively. The ripple effects were continuing to spread in ways we couldn't track or measure. Every person who'd heard our story and decided to speak up rather than stay silent. Every business owner who'd examined their practices and made changes. Every employee who'd been trained to recognize their biases and treat all customers with dignity. But the work was far from finished. Discrimination still existed in countless forms across countless industries. Assumptions were still being made based on appearance, age, race, and class. People were still being treated as if they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. The difference was that now there was a model for addressing these issues systematically, a vocabulary for discussing them constructively, and a growing movement of people committed to creating change. So here's what I want you to understand. What happened to me at Etoile wasn't unique. Discrimination happens every day, in every industry, in every community. But what made our situation different wasn't the discrimination itself. It was how we chose to respond to it. We could have walked away. We could have accepted the treatment as just part of how the world works. We could have sought only punishment rather than transformation. Instead, we chose to create something better. The question isn't whether you'll encounter unfairness, prejudice, or discrimination in your life. You will. The question is what you'll do when that happens. Will you accept it? Will you fight it? Or will you use it as an opportunity to create lasting change? You have more power than you realize. Your voice matters more than you know. Your actions can have ripple effects that extend far beyond what you can see. Don't wait for someone else to create the change you want to see. Don't assume that discrimination is just how things are and always will be. Don't underestimate your ability to make a difference. Stand up, speak out, demand better. And when you encounter resistance, remember that every significant change in history started with someone who refused to accept the status quo. The world is waiting for you to help shape it. What will you choose to do? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.